I'm Pat Duggins. I'm the news director for Alabama Public Radio, but for about 24 years I covered the space program for National Public Radio here in Brevard. And I'm also here to inaugurate my new book, Trailblazing Mars, NASA's Next Giant Leap, which is just coming out from University Press of Florida. I was about 8 years old when Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin first stepped on the moon. See, I'm an Air Force kid. So my family and I were in Anchorage, Alaska when Neil and Buzz, came down in one small step and all that sort of stuff. But then, fortuitously, my dad was transferred over to Brevard County's Patrick Air Force Base. So here I am, walking out in my backyard, watching Apollo 14 going off, watching the Voyagers, Pioneer 10, Pioneer 11. And that kind of was like, the kernel of inspiration that got me going toward space journalism. But my very first story as a reporter was, unfortunately, the Challenger accident back in 1986. Here in Brevard County, obviously, Kennedy Space Center is an operational center, so we're talking about like 10,000 people, unfortunately, who are going to lose their positions. But also, the Obama administration wants to do away with a return to the moon. Now, Project Orion and the Ares rocket, that's all controlled out of the Marshall Space Flight Center in Alabama. So Alabama's hurting too. That's Huntsville in the north part of the state. But if they do push ahead with the idea of a heavy lift rocket, a brand new one, kind of like the Saturn V redo, that would be created in Alabama, which is good news for us. It would launch out of Florida, which is good news for Florida. And it would also get people out of Earth orbit for the first time since 1972. I mean, my first book, the whole premise of it was that Apollo worked because it was a mission that went looking for a spacecraft, and the shuttle didn't work because it was a spacecraft that went looking for a mission. Now you move into Trailblazing Mars, which is the next step in this progression, this literary progression. If you're going to go to Mars, you have to put the shuttle away. It has to go into museums. You have to move on to the rocket. And then after that, we'll just see. There's going to be a progression, whether it's from Earth to asteroids and explore there and go on to Mars, or maybe go back to the moon and go on to Mars. There has to be that stair-step progression, which is the way NASA's done everything. It would have to be the Columbia accident in 2003, which was, it was a 2-week mission, really boring. I mean, not a whole lot going on there. I mean, like, thank goodness for the Super Bowl, because you had some fans of the Raiders and some fans of Tampa Bay. So the astronauts kind of argued back and forth during a press conference, so there was something there. And one of the air conditioners broke inside the Space Hab science module, so they had to fix that, so we got to cover that. But not a whole lot going on, very arcane science. So I'm out of the Kennedy Space Center's runway at the very tail end of the mission. They've just fired their jets. They're coming back. The damage to the heat shield on the wing had already occurred at that point. So I'm sitting there and I'm writing my first post-landing spot. Shuttle's coming back, everything's fine. Eileen Collins getting ready for the next mission, take up the next space station crew. And as you know, 2 minutes prior to any kind of a shuttle touchdown, you hear the double sonic booms off the nose and the tail. Boom, boom, like a double shotgun blast. Well, I'm sitting there and my eyes keep flicking up out at the landing strip. You've got this big piece of grass, and then you've got the digital clock that counts down to the landing, and then there's the runway. So when the clock ticks to 0, the shuttle goes by, and you're close enough you can read United States on the side. So I'm writing my story, and I'm watching the clock, and it's 2 minutes. Then it keeps going, and there's no sound. So at that point, close the laptop, find the first NASA manager I could find, and said, well, and she responded, we lost an orbiter. And at that point, about 3 hours of live coverage without script started up with National Public Radio. It was Saturday, so it was Weekend Edition Saturday with Scott Simon. And that probably was the most memorable shuttle mission I ever covered. NASA's been talking about sending human beings to Mars since the very beginning, because everybody knows John F. Kennedy in his speech at Rice University, we choose to go to the moon in this decade. Well, what people forget is that 1 year prior to that talk, we were smarting from the fact that the Russians had just put Yuri Gagarin up. President Kennedy, 1 year prior to Rice, goes in front of Congress, gives the exact same moon speech, but he included something extra. He challenged Congress at that time to come up with money for a nuclear-powered rocket that would send astronauts beyond Moon into the end of the solar system. And to everybody at NASA, that meant Mars. The biggest growing pains for NASA in terms of going on to Mars is going to come along with President Obama's idea of using commercial space capsules in order to take people to the space station. Because NASA asked me to come up to Washington a couple of months ago and give a lecture on the future of the space program for their engineers. And they asked me what it was going to be like, working with the commercial guys. And I kind of drew the analogy of like a baby boomer and a Gen Xer working in the same workplace. You know, the baby boomer, which is NASA, kind of like, you know, works their way up through the ranks and takes things slow and they take their opportunities, and there may be a setback or two, but they generally play by the rules. And not to make, you know, sweeping generalizations, but the Gen Xers kind of want things to happen fast. They're less patient, paying their dues. Hey, great idea as long as it doesn't slow things down. So that's kind of what NASA is going to be going through, dealing with the commercial guys, because SpaceX, they're the people that came up with the new capsule, and when they came up with the capsule, it was very clear they wanted to put humans in it. So I went ahead and talked to them about it and said, if NASA gave you all the money in the world to make this happen, how fast could you do it? And they said, give us the money, we'll do it in 2 years, 2 years. Took that to NASA, somebody who was in charge of certifying spacecraft as safe to fly, and without paraphrasing too much, his reaction was, SpaceX said what? 4 years, 4 years it's going to take to do this, all right. And I think that's kind of be the tension that's going to happen, you know, as they start moving forward. We'll see if it'll work. The whole point is that if we send people to Mars, NASA has got to get rid of the idea of space travel as being sort of like a summer vacation. You go to Mars, it's not going to be like, you know, 6 months up and you take a box lunch. You've got to be able to go there, survive, solve your problems, take care of any personal crises. It's almost like trailblazing the American West. That's going to make the first mission interesting, because they're talking about it not landing on Mars, but actually just a flyby. So you have to be, depending on which route you take, 3 months to 6 months to get there. Then you have to wait a year for the Earth and Mars to line up again, and then 3 months to 6 months to get back. So you're telling somebody they're giving up like 3 years of their life, and they're not going to walk on Mars? It's going to be interesting to see who signs up for that. That's the way travel to Mars is going to be, and that's why you have to make sure that all of the technology you take with you is going to work really well, because if you're halfway to Mars and your ship breaks down, what do you think Houston's going to do? You know, we'll call the AAA and send them after you, you know. Leave the hood up on your spaceship so they know that it's you, okay? Those people are going to be in real trouble, which, interestingly enough, in the book, I take a look at a survey that they did at the Johnson Space Center, and they put up on the bulletin board there was a survey for all the astronauts who are currently flying the shuttle, and they said, pick the most important person that's going to go with you on a trip to Mars. And they had the commander, the pilot, the doctor, the geologist, and the name of the person that everybody picked as the most important guy on the crew was the mechanic, Chief Engineer Scott, the guy who's going to fix the ship if it breaks down. So even now, they know that if you're on your way to Mars and something happens, you're on your own. Again, it's going to be a lot different from what we're doing now in space. A lot of people say that not a single technical advancement occurred because Neil Armstrong walked on the moon. And I absolutely agree with that. But solving all of the problems that put him on the moon is where all this technology comes from. I mean, like NASA, back during the days of Apollo and the shuttle, they wanted to come up with scratch-resistant visors for their space helmets. Well, the optical industry came along and adapted that into the scratch-resistant lenses that you have on your eyeglasses these days. A lot of people like to say that NASA invented cordless power tools. Well, they really didn't, but they did work with Black & Decker at a time where they were developing this technology, and because of that, the rechargeable batteries became better. And because of that, I think you could make a very good case that a multi-billion-dollar industry was helped because of the space program, and the list goes on. And a lot of that money, most of that money, frankly, gets spent here on Earth. So if you're in favor of space, and if you're in favor of going to Mars, a lot of the technology that's going to, you know, put the people there is going to come while you're still on Earth. One person that I interviewed, I interviewed him a long time ago, and then I utilized him for the book, was a nice long talk with Alan Shepard, America's first man in space. And, you know, we talked about, you know, walking on the moon during Apollo 14, but also he said one of his proudest moments had nothing to do with being in space. I mean, he was working with Space Camp at the time, and he had this little kid walk up to him, and he said, and this is the direct quote, he said, "Admiral, this is the first place I've ever been where it's cool to be smart." And you could just see, and I mean, very little makes Alan Shepard's eyes light up. I mean, I'll tell you, if you ever met him and spoke to him, you know, he's very much, you know, businesslike. But that really touched him. And getting kids interested in that, it's the challenge that I guess, you know, we folks with the grandpa action here have to make sure that that they're willing to accept. Because if anybody goes to the surface of Mars, they're going to be grade school age right now. So now's the time to get them interested.